So I'm going to introduce Sam here and then let him get started. So Sam Tan is the previous president of the Bonsai Society of San Francisco. He is a very passionate practitioner and enjoys creating bonsai from native North American species. He's studied under Ryan Neal at Bonsai Mirai, and he interned there in 2019. He's exhibited work at the 2022 and 2024 Pacific Bonsai Expo, and the 2024 he also served as a demonstrator as well. If you guys would like to see more of his stuff, you can check him out on Instagram. He regularly posts his trees on there at Sam Tan Bonsai, all one word. So with that, I'll hand it over to Sam and let him get talking about these pretty awesome trees we got up here.
Thank you. Well, it's nice to be back. I made the mistake today of driving at in the afternoon from the Bay Area. It was terrible. It took me 3 hours. So for those of you who saw me eating dinner just now, I just gotten here, but I'm really glad to make it on time. I believe the last time I was here, was it 2 years ago? 2 years ago, I was talking about um, pygmy cypresses. That's right. So I guess this is a continuation, a series of talks, species-specific talks on a bunch of NorCal natives. So today we are going to talk about coast redwood. Similar presentation. I brought a few trees from my collection. We'll talk about them shortly. But here is how this is going to go down. Um, Broadly speaking, I plan to talk about, just general facts about the species most of you already know. And before we get into techniques, I just wanted to talk about style, in terms of bonsai or natural redwoods. I think it's important to discuss, where do we draw inspiration from and what kinds of forms are we trying to achieve in bonsai with redwood. Following which, we're going to talk about many techniques that many of you probably dabbled with, and are familiar with, pinching, pruning, and so on. And then we'll go on to discuss, the kind of broader development plan. So you have a raw piece of material. What's the game plan? How do you phase this over 3 or 4 years? And lastly, we'll go into some case studies from my own collection. I have them here, but I also have a bunch of cool pictures now that I've been doing this for long enough. Sound good? Um, Want this to be conversational, so stop me if you have any questions. Don't have to wait till the end. Awesome. All right. Well, let's go into it. Actually, could someone move that cursor away? It's just kind of an oh, that's my cursor. There we go. Just somewhere. Oh yeah. Oh yeah. Oh, there we go. Yeah, on the right. Oh, perfect. Oh, perfect. Okay, great. All right. So stuff most of you already know. So who owns redwood bonsai here? Show of hands. Awesome. Uh, what do people like most about redwood bonsai? Can't kill them strong. I have killed one early in my bonsai, but that's probably true. Very strong growers too. Anything else? Like foliage, evergreen. Okay, okay, nice. What challenges have people had with redwood bonsai? Random branch death. Makes sense. We'll talk about that. Okay, yeah, they grow a lot. They put on many flashes. For me personally, branch refinement is a lot of work. Actually, it turns out they take quite a while to kind of build that woody structure you want in bonsai. Awesome. I actually don't, people don't recommend redwoods enough, I think, to beginners. I think they're actually a pretty good beginner tree in that they're pretty forgiving of mistakes. You can start from scratch. You can do a whole bunch of different development strategies and forms of them, and they keep you really busy. So if you have like 1 to 3 trees, you can always be doing something, which is not true for many species. All right, so well, what do we know about these? So today we're talking about mostly coast redwood, Sequoia sempervirens. So not giant sequoia, which are fairly rare as bonsai actually. We know about their native range, all the way from Central California all the way up to Southern Oregon. You find them all along the coast. They are the tallest tree species in the world, not the largest. The largest, I think, by volume, that's the giant sequoia, right? Or well, the largest one that exists is a giant sequoia. The tallest tree that is known to exist is a coast redwood, and then the oldest would be a bristlecone pine, all in California, which is pretty cool. So tall, they have a very tall, kind of vertical growth habit. Many of you own redwoods probably already know that they are very moisture loving. They prefer wet conditions. consequently, for me, I water these kind of the way I water deciduous trees. I'm looking at the soil. If it looks like it's approaching halfway dry, I water them, right? Whereas that would be different for a high mountain pine, where you might wait till it's about 70% dry or so before watering them. I also tend to use pretty high Akadama mixes for my redwood. It just keeps them wetter for longer, and they can kind of tolerate those wet conditions and kind of benefit from being the kind of the slowing down of their growth from a wetter mix. Um, they can tolerate full sun totally fine. In full sun, they tend to get a slightly lighter yellow color. In shade, they tend to be a little bit greener. I think partial shade is totally fine, but if you put them in too much shade, like many bonsai trees, you'll notice that they start getting a leggy kind of growth habit that's not particularly aesthetic or useful for bonsai. I've gone full and 80%. Honestly, not a big not a big difference between the two. I've seen a lot of people do 1-1-1 as well, and it works. I don't think there's a magic soil mix, but what you do need to do is adjust your watering and whatever microclimate you put them in to accommodate, the soil mix. If you do 1-1-1, you would expect them to dry a lot faster. They already use a lot of water, so you might have to water multiple times a day when it's hot, or put it in morning sun, afternoon shade. So I do 100% Akadama or 80%, and it works totally fine. Um, awesome. Next, just growth habit. Fairly basic facts. I've always kind of offhandedly referred to redwood, the kind of the redwood growth habit as kind of like a frond growth, but these aren't actually fronds. That's a fern thing. These are actually leaves, right? So you have these shoots, and each of these little needles, I guess you call them needles, they are the leaves of the tree. And redwoods actually have really, they naturally have this tight alternating pattern in their growth. So if you observe your redwoods, you look at them carefully, they tend to put on growth kind of at alternating junctions. And these internodes can be very small, and they're usually staggered. I point this out because, trees that naturally have the alternating growth habit tend to lend themselves pretty well to bonsai, because that typically is the branch structure you want to build in the long term. The next thing about redwoods is that they bud at, there is potential for bud. When they do bud, they bud at these leaf axils, right? So these junctions between the leaves and the actual shoot, that's where you expect buds to occur. And there really is potential for budding at basically all the leaf axils. One of the challenges of redwoods is you don't really know which axle they're going to set a bud at until it kind of happens. And so we'll go into that, and when we go into technique. But if you're thinking about just in terms of when you're wiring it, when you're cutting it, where you're going to see the response, you're going to see the buds form really at the base of these leaves over here. Anyone who's grown these redwoods probably know what that looks like. I'll have pictures to show you how this looks like shortly. All makes sense? Super basic. Okay, so let's talk about style. So, I have various redwoods. I brought a few here in kind of various kind of styles. The short, stout, small tree on the left, that's definitely styled in a kind of a bonsai style, kind of modeled after kind of a thick high mountain conifer. So that's a highly stylized, not really exactly natural style redwood. The tree in the middle, that was the tree in the first slide. You might have seen it at the first Pacific Bonsai Expo. That tree is also not exactly natural, highly stylized. It is a twin apex tree, yeah, it is inspired by some aspects of kind of natural redwood growth habit. We'll talk about it in a moment. And then the other tree on the right, that's kind of my spin on a formal upright style. This tree is probably maybe the most kind of nature inspired, but it's also not particularly natural in a bunch of ways that we'll talk about it. But I just wanted to show kind of a bunch of different ways you may build your redwoods. I say that all to say that, even though I really like kind of naturalistic bonsai, kind of what you think of as natural and what you take from nature and how you apply it to your bonsai really varies person to person. I do think it's useful to start just looking at some pictures of the trees in the wild, older versions of the trees especially, just to see if there are things about them, about these trees that, we may like to take into our bonsai when we try to represent them in a smaller form. So here are a few pictures. These are pictures of the base of redwood trees, right? So I think one very characteristic feature of redwoods in their natural upright form is that, they have a subtle transition of taper, but a very obvious root flare at the base, right? And anyone who's walked in a redwood forest would have experienced, the look, the buttress of a kind of redwood trunk. It's not massive, but it's noticeable. So surface root flare is a thing. And also redwoods that have experienced fire, very much part of their natural life cycle, will tend to have these burn marks, these hollows that form at kind of the base of the tree, right? So that's useful information for if you are carving a tree, for example. It might influence kind of where you decide to create deadwood, where you decide to create hollows. If you're going for something natural, kind of a V-shaped hollow at the base of the trunk is extremely common to see in nature, and is something you'd probably see on an older tree, because the older trees are the ones that have survived fires and have outcompeted the ones around it. So if you're trying, generally speaking in bonsai, we try to represent an older form of a tree. We try to make the tree look a lot older than it is. And so it's useful to know, well, for this species in nature, what are the signs of age? The one on the left, I was actually just in Muir Woods taking a friend visiting from out of town yesterday. So, these pictures are all various pictures of redwoods in kind of kind of a forest kind of group setting. Most typically you see redwoods growing next to each other, fairly close to each other. And consequently, something you'll notice when you see redwoods in this kind of situation is that their foliage, I mean, the canopy of the tree really starts maybe at least 1/3 the way up the trunk, if not halfway up the trunk. By nature of the trees growing so close to each other and having competition, they're just trying to grow taller and taller. The lower branches die off after a while, and they don't really have space to survive next to all the trees that are close to them. This would be different from a redwood growing alone in some kind of setting where it has no competition around it. They take on a very different form in that case. Here are here are some pictures of redwoods from far away, right? I think most of us experience redwoods very close up from the base. You don't get to see the whole canopy. Here are just a few examples, I took from Muir Woods. You'll notice that there are a variety of canopy shapes. I'd say the trees on the left, in general, in the conifer growth habit, younger trees tend to have pointier tops, and as the trees get older and older, they tend to have slightly more low profile rounded tops. So, if the only picture you've ever seen of redwoods on the left, you might conclude that you should make all your redwoods pointy top, but that's not the case. It really depends on how old the tree is, the environment it's in, and kind of exactly how old it is, and the environmental factors. So these are a few pictures of redwoods. I'm gonna go to other pictures I took from the internet of like much older growth redwoods, and you can see a much different kind of mature canopy that forms. From far away, you wouldn't realize that they had this kind of almost frond-like growth habit. They almost look like a juniper or something else. But they do get quite full, and as you can tell, they start losing their pointiness as they start getting more and more mature. More pictures of kind of, redwood kind of pads. I would say redwoods in nature are not the most well-organized trees, right? Unlike, say, a cedar juniper, you see those up in the, around Tahoe, and they kind of bonsai themselves. They have canopies that kind of resemble an organized bonsai. Redwoods, not usually. You get a kind of a, they have these cloudy tufts, but they're usually kind of messy in nature. And I bring that up because in bonsai, we typically have a much more organized canopy for most of our species. So I definitely consider a lot of the redwood work I do highly stylized in this sense, because I think a true to form natural redwood would be a lot more rough in form. A few more pictures. Interesting, kind of different redwoods I've seen kind of in different conditions, right? So this is a redwood maybe kind of in that forest setting, out competing the neighbors around it. Has a lot of the characteristics we just talked about, slightly more rounded top as well. This other tree is standing near the visitor center, near the parking lot in Muir Woods. I thought this one was interesting. It's kind of dark, so it's a bit hard to see, but this tree has a lot of low drooping branches, which is interesting. And you do see that sometimes in redwoods. This was just growing distinctly off to the side, kind of in a different section than where the rest of the grove is. And I just thought that this expression of the low, the fact that this tree had very low exposed drop branches was interesting because that's not what you typically see in many of the redwoods in the grove itself. So again, environment really matters. This tree I have not seen in person before. This is the grandfather tree. I believe it's pretty far up north near the border to Oregon. And I think this tree is kind of special in that it's not growing around any other redwoods, and you can tell it has a very different growth habit, a very different kind of expression than the other trees we've seen before. It also has a bit of this kind of candelabra kind of reiterative style. You'll notice that it's a clump and it has multiple trunks kind of coming up and rising up to form their kind of individual apices, right? And again, in a mature, this is an old tree, pretty mature tree, pretty tufty kind of cloudy canopy. I would like to see this tree sometime. Has anyone been up there and seen this tree? You have the grandfather tree? Pretty cool redwood. Maybe one of the cooler ones that I've seen in pictures. All right. So just some inspiration to kind of prime our brains before we talk about bonsai. Now, let's talk about bonsai. We have pictures of bonsai. These are two trees from the first Pacific Bonsai Expo. Lady in the back had asked about the hollow. There we go, right there. So, what do folks think? Beautiful trees, both very beautiful trees in their own right? Who, not to say any tree is good or bad, but who prefers the tree on the left? Who prefers the tree on the right? Who likes both trees? Cool. So obviously trees styled in kind of very different ways, right? You can the tree on the left, that belongs to the bonsai garden at Lake Merritt. I think this is redwood 101. Kind of a very naturalistic redwood, kind of plays off a lot of the things that we just saw, right? The foliage starting from, about the canopy starting from about 2/3 the way up the trunk, the hollow, the buttress, the kind of that transition of taper. And kind of a slightly loose presentation to the foliage, which I did appreciate at that show. This tree over here, not at all a formal upright, right? I mean, the bones of this tree itself, that's a big burly stump. For those of you who have worked with Bob Scheinman or bought trees from him, he's probably told you how he digs these trees up, right? These stumps are really kind of the burl, like kind of the root burls of these trees that were buried underground. And some of these trees had been, kind of cut flush to the ground, right? But they survived nonetheless. And later on, you dig them up and you have these really interesting forms that really always grew under the ground. So, material like this tends to be handled in more of a bonsai style, kind of inspired by other forms in bonsai. So this had, very, very formal pads, very full pads, very kind of powerful, stout appearance, and kind of much less kind of separation, bigger pads, rounder pads versus kind of smaller, more separated pads. So both beautiful trees in their own right, just very different. Two other trees. Show of hands. Who likes the one on the right? I like it. Who likes the one on the left? And who likes them both? Awesome, cool. So these are actually two trees. Both made by my teacher Ryan Neal, both from his collection. Again, very, very, very different styles of trees. Again, the one on the right, much more of a bonsai style, and the one on the left, actually one of his earlier experiments in the reiterative style of the tree, right? So instead of making this a single trunk tree, he kind of went with many different smaller trunks, kind of growing out of an older trunk that had died back. So. Very interesting growth habit, I think kind of inspired by what he saw up in Redwood National Park, different groves up there. Two more trees. All right. Show of hands. Tree on the left. Tree on the right. 50-50. Again, both very beautiful trees. I believe the tree on the right, most of you might have seen at the second Pacific Bonsai Expo. That tree belongs to Jeremiah Lee. And I think it's a tree he has developed over time in collaboration with Peter T. The tree on the left belongs to the Pacific Bonsai Museum up in Federal Way near Seattle. And this picture, I think, was taken in the natives exhibit some years ago, where they kind of paired the trees with kind of contemporary, kind of stylized, kind of drawings of kind of natural settings. And I really like this composition and kind of the perspective the painting gives, in both kind of, uh, you know, giving you a view of the trees of a redwood forest when you're looking up from a canopy, and then juxtaposing that with the tree kind of standing in front of you in a kind of a different head-on view. But the painting also kind of serving to draw focus to the tree in the center is kind of very interesting composition to me. But both very interesting trees, again, very different trees, right? If you look at the tree on the left, again, much more of a tree in a naturalistic style. And if you look at how thin this trunk is, this tree is meant to evoke a redwood viewed from much further away. Much more subtle transition of taper, not quite as powerful a trunk, but again, many of the features we've discussed that are quite natural, including the canopy of the tree kind of starting a bit further up. The tree on the right, Jeremiah's tree, kind of a fusion of styles, a bit of a really interesting Frankenstein, right? On the one hand, it is a bit of a tall tree that has the height and kind of upper canopy style of a traditional kind of upright tree, but then also kind of a really large hulking base with a cascading branch. So kind of an interesting kind of fusion of styles. I don't know if there's a name for it, and it doesn't have to be a name for it, but a much more stylized take than the tree on the left. Cool. All right. So we're talking about style, and I have an aside here about structure. The tree in front of you is not a redwood. Just so you know, this is a Japanese black pine I took a picture of at a Kokofu exhibit that I attended a few years ago. So why am I putting a picture of a Japanese black pine in front of you at a redwood presentation? This tree is the ideal formal upright. Is a really really rare kind of tree. And this, when I saw it, I was like, wow, this is the perfect formal upright if I've ever seen one. I'm bringing this up because a lot of people, when they're building a redwood bonsai and they're trying to go for a tree that is natural, or they have a kind of a tall trunk and they want to build a formal upright, um, I think a lot of people try to shoehorn their tree into that style, but it turns out the actual traditional formal upright, by the books formal upright tree is extremely hard to build, and it's extremely hard to find. If you look at this tree for a moment, this tree has kind of perfect transition of taper. I'm guessing up here the tree transitions to a few primary branches that are pretty fine in the top that source the canopy. This tree doesn't really happen on its own. It's definitely field grown. It was probably not Yamadori and very intentionally grown this way. So if you were to think about the structure of this tree, it probably looks something like this, right? This is this tree of this, again, perfect transition of taper, transitions out into a few primary branches, and you have all the other primary branches kind of laid out. I didn't actually look into that tree, but my guess is that this is the structure of that tree. Um, Other people sometimes build their formal uprights in this way, where the top of the tree kind of has primary branches going out in all directions, forming this bigger canopy. As an aside, I'm much more of a fan of building formal uprights or most of my conifers in this way, only because for me, I prefer that in my trees the primary lines of the tree are all consistent at the same angle. And what I don't love about this style of formal upright is that higher up the tree, you have primary branches kind of rising up like this, um, which is just not kind of my design ethos for conifers. Anyways, going back to that tree, this is probably what that is. Most of the time, when we have a redwood trunk, we have this, right? This is a tree from my collection. Actually, wait, this is that tree over there. So when I bought it, ignore the foliage for a moment. This is what I got. The difference between this and that hypothetical tree over here is that you have the stump cut, right? This tree was probably a much taller tree that got cut down at some point. You probably have a stump of at least, 2 to 3 inches or more, and you have to decide what to do about it. If you wanted to grow a traditional formal upright from this, it is extremely difficult, because what you really need to do is to grow a new shoot somewhere up top here and have that shoot get so thick such that you can heel over that stump and then create that perfect transition that you saw back here, right? Most of the time, that will take you a very long time. And if the stump is big enough, you will never be able to naturalize that taper, right? The only way you get taper like this, kind of like in growing a deciduous tree, is over time very gradually cutting those leaders when they haven't grown so thick, so that whatever stub you leave behind can actually heal over. So what I'm really trying to say is, if you have this, you can forget about the traditional formal upright unless you have a few decades and really good carving skill, right? I think what most people end up doing is they build something like this, right? They build a tree of this structure to kind of hide that stump with a bunch of primary branches kind of laid over the top. For me, that's not my preference. I'm not saying this is wrong, but I think this would be a tree that's this would be a structure of an upright redwood that's really trying really hard to be a formal upright when it doesn't really have that structure, especially around the top, to be that kind of tree. So next time you see next time you see a tree like that, look into the top of the canopy and see what's in there. You may be surprised or you may not. How I prefer to approach material like this is maybe if a design like so, right? So actually that tree over there has this structure, right? Where instead of trying to hide the fact that I have a stump cut, actually both trees, the tree in the middle over here and the taller tree, both uprights, they both have kind of a new apex, a new leader growing off the side of the trunk, right? So I don't really try to hide the fact that there is a stump cut or there was a dead and previously bigger trunk. You run with that concept, and for me at least, I like to build a tree that tells the story of regrowth after some kind of event that caused the bigger, older tree to die, right? Again, my drawings aren't the best. Please, and thank you all for your patience with these. But also in this drawing, I also tried to show smaller branch pads. You'll notice that relative to a design that has larger branch pads, once you shrink the branch pads down, you have a different perspective of the tree. It looks like a bigger tree. It looks like a more complex and older tree, and that tends to be my preference. There are other things you can do with this, and obviously with the stump cut, what you probably do is carve it down a bit. If you look at that tree over there that I have, feel free to take a look closer later. You would tend to do a bit of hand carving to try to naturalize that stump cut, so it looks like the much larger tree broke off. It got struck by lightning. It got something happened to it that caused it to tear off. That's probably what you want to do. There are many other possibilities too. When you have a piece of material like this, you could build two apexes, right? Redwoods, depending on where they're growing, really tend to have this reiterative growth habit where branches become new apexes, and you kind of have these mini trees on the tree itself. So this is one idea, and you can take this concept even further, and you can build a tree of a lot of mini apexes. This would be a structure similar to the Ryan Neal tree I showed you just now in the picture. So these are all just examples. There are many ways to kind of, skin this cat, but I just wanted to bring up the many possibilities you might have for designing a piece of material like this. Because, for any of you who go up to Bob Scheinman's, you'll see he has like 20 of these, right? And it's not always the case that you can build a perfect formal upright with those trees. If you do find one, call me because I want it. Does that make sense? Okay, well, I'll get off my kind of structure soapbox. Again, structures, it's all, this is totally my opinion, right? And like different people have different ideas of what tree structure they want to build into their bonsai. This is mine. Great. So I talked about the formal upright. There's also the other situation you commonly come across when you buy collected redwood material, which is the burl, right? So this tree over here, that's that tree a few years ago. So oftentimes you get this awesome piece of half deadwood, half live tree, right? And so what do you do to it? I think a lot of people, I've seen a lot of redwoods, I guess, built with kind of this kind of structure, almost as like an azalea, right? Where you have the low branches going down, and then around the top of the tree, again, you have this broader kind of apical area built with a bunch of small primary branches coming up like this. I don't build my redwoods this way mainly because, again, with conifers, I prefer to have, if I'm going for a traditional kind of Japanese-inspired conifer style, I like all my primary branch angles to be consistent. I like all of them dropping. So I don't like it when the bottom branch is dropping down, and then further up the tree, you start having this, or even having an upward kind of branch angle all the way from the bottom of the tree. That kind of structure is a bit more of like a deciduous structure. If you think of like a big Korean hornbeam or like a Japanese maple. And for my conifers, I prefer a structure that's down, right? And like if you just look at if you just again put up with my crappy drawing, it kind of gives the tree a bit of a different character. It looks like an older tree. It looks like um a tree that has gone through a lot, right? Again, my preference. This is one way you might do it. This is another way you might do it. But again, in all these kind of hypothetical versions of that tree, um, I'm really trying to keep my branch structure, my branch angles consistent. Something else about stumps like this that's pretty important is that you really have to choose. What's really important when you're building these is you have to choose the where you want the primary branches to originate, and you really want to give them some room because the tree is probably going to have a ton of be popping a ton of shoots from all over the trunk, and if you leave too many of them, you can build a really full canopy, but each of those branches are going to be thin and kind of they're not going to have their own kind of substructure, right? If you leave too many primary branches on the tree, those branches don't have room to divide and source smaller pads and kind of more substructure. So instead of leaving 20 branches on the trunk, I might leave 4, and each of those primary branches might then source 3 or 4 secondary branches that each source their own pads, right? And that's again the kind of structure that I prefer. So if you look at this later on when you guys have time, take a look at the redwood over here, and just maybe you can reverse engineer how I chose the primary branch points. And I basically typically want them to be spaced out. I want them to be on different levels of the tree. And I typically want only one branch originating at each point instead of having multiple shoots coming off from one point. In the long term, I think that leads to kind of a more sustainable, beautiful structure, if that makes sense. All right. I'll stop talking about structure, but that's my view on it for building redwoods. Does that make sense? Cool. All right. How are we doing on time? Cool. Okay, I want to make sure. Okay, then let's do the boring stuff. Let's talk about techniques. So everyone probably knows this first technique, pinching. Who's pinched? Who's pinched redwoods? Could someone describe pinching? Right. Yes. Very tedious, very monotonous. It's a lot of work. So I think pinching is a bit of a it's a bit of a confusing term because pinching, at face value, if you think of the term, it kind of refers to the method by which you're removing the foliage. But that's not all there is to pinching, right? Because you could do pinching. Some people do pinching with scissors, right? It's more a matter of when you're removing the foliage and kind of how much of the foliage you're removing. That's really the crux of this technique. It doesn't matter if you use your fingers or scissors. So pinching is when you're removing foliage as the tree is actively pushing. Um, I think the reason it's called pinching is that when the tree is actively putting out a new flush, you'll notice that that new growth is soft, it's wet, it's easy to remove with your fingers. And this is the time this is the time in the tree's growth cycle when you can actually effectively remove growth with your fingers. If you wait until that flush of growth has hardened off, where that foliage is waxier, it's darker, it's no longer as soft and fleshy. You try to pull it with your fingers, it won't come off quite the same way. So again, this is why we tend to remove with our fingers. There's nothing wrong with using scissors. It just tends to be easy to do it with the fingers. There are 2 reasons we might pinch, right? I think one very popular reason to pinch that most people understand is that where you pinch, when you typically pinch off some of the new growth, that leaf axil that you leave behind, the tree will tend to set buds, at the point of your pinch, right? So if in your development plan you want buds at that pinch point, this is a good time to both shorten the length of the tree of that shoot and also expect buds to be left behind where you pinch. The other reason for pinching, and this goes beyond redwoods in general, for many species that we can pinch, you're actually also encouraging the tree to allocate resources to other buds, weaker buds, buds further back into the tree that the tree hasn't allocated energy to. So if you don't pinch, actually, I have a small example here of what it might look like to pinch. Actually, I'll show you in a sec, but this tree over here actually is still in its flush, which is weird. It's finishing off, right? We've had a bit of late heat in the fall this year. I'm not sure if that was the case up here, but you'll notice that all this growth on the tips, it's much greener and lighter than the older growth from the tree, which is darker. Um, Typically, when you see this, you're in the kind of the pinching zone, right? Once all the foliage is a uniform darker green color, you're done. And there is a transition between these two phases where you start tugging at these leaves and they're less fleshy and they don't detach as easily. That's also when you're done, right? So that's the pinching window. Yes, sir. Y- yes.
Bushy
Yes.
than the other part
Sure.
of the tree. Now, why is that so? Is that because you don't want to pinch it, or
We'll talk
you
about
do
that in a
that?
moment, but the short answer is during the growing season, because the top of the tree gets all the sun, there's nothing blocking it. It's gonna tend to grow a lot more, and it's gonna set a lot more buds. So until I can come in and prune it like that through the growing season, that area is gonna get more dense. Pinching is one way to rein in on that. I am reining in on that, but the overall density of the area will be brought in balance with the rest of the tree when I later come in and prune it. And that's a really good question. And sorry, I did not repeat that question. The question was, why is the top of the tree so much more dense and full and bushy than the rest of the tree? Is it because I'm not pinching it? Um, no, and that's the natural course of each flush, and we will correct it after the flush. And I'll talk about that shortly. We had a question in the back.
How young of the bud can you pinch?
That's also a good
Or,
question.
it, I don't know, to make it more of a,
Okay, I'll answer that in a few slides because I have a bunch of pictures. All right, let's quickly talk about, actually, before I go into those pictures, I just want to finish my point there. If you don't pinch, and I'm sure many of you have missed out on pinching on your redwoods, what what happens? What happens when you don't pinch your redwood shoots? They get leggy, right? Um, Redwoods and kind of an entire kind of subcategory of kind of tree species we use in bonsai. If you don't pinch them, the tree will just allocate energy into that elongating shoot and keep getting it longer, right? At the expense of everything else. This is in contrast to, say, I don't know, on the other extreme, something like a Kishu juniper, where if you left it to its own devices, it's going to put on a lot of lateral growth that is, broadly speaking, pretty even before it starts extending at some point. For species like redwoods, they opportunistically invest a lot of energy into elongating certain shoots that are strong, right? And so pinching is kind of a way to say, hey, tree, don't spend your energy on this piece anymore. And instead, all those other buds behind that shoot that you're not growing out, like grow those, right? So pinching is really an energy reallocation technique as well. And by doing it during the growing season, you end up getting, by the time the tree hardens off, you get a lot more usable growth, right? You instead of having, let's say you get 20 shoots in the tree, hypothetically, and four of them are extending. If you didn't pinch them, you have four very long shoots and not many others. If you had pinched it, you might have 20 medium length shoots, right? Or even more. So that's kind of a big function of pinching as well in general in bonsai.
Letting elongate. Are you not pinching those at all then, just to focus all the energy on those branches?
Everyone wants spoilers. Yeah. So the question, the question was, well, am I not pinching those guys down low on the tree on the right? Yes, I'm not pinching them. Those are sacrifice branches. Actually, thank you for pointing that out because this is what it looks like if you don't pinch. This is what shoots look like if you don't pinch them, right? They get really long. In this case, that's working as intended, and we will talk about that in a bit. But Yes, another question.
And what do you do when the branch gets to the length you want it and we're still getting all this green foliage?
Sure. So pinching is the question is, what do you do when the branch gets to your desired length, and then you're still getting extensions, right? You kind of do the same thing you do with many other finished bonsai, which is that in general, once your tree is refined or you get to the target silhouette, right, you are trying to manage the incremental creep of that canopy, right? By pruning or pinching, you are slowing the tree down and letting the tree grow a little bit every year, but not too much. Pinching is part of that strategy, right? By pinching the exterior of the silhouette, right, of the canopy, you prevent the tree from investing in expanding the size of the silhouette, and you encourage the tree to kind of invest in the back buds or the buds in the interior of the tree. Yeah, so yeah, oh sorry. The question is, are you always pinching back to the dark green buds? Let's actually take a look at what pinching actually looks like. So I have a few pictures here. So here is your nice little green fleshy growth, right? That's this flush, and everything behind it, that darker green stuff, that's the old flush, right? So with pinching, if you do this using your fingers, you would grab a bunch of those new leaves with the fleshy part of your fingers, and you probably either leverage it up or down so you can cleanly disconnect a bunch of those leaves from the shoot. Notice how I'm leaving a few leaves behind, right? A key part of the pinching technique is to leave some of the new shoots behind. You don't want to take all the new growth off, right? Because that over time is going to be too much of an energy drain on the tree. So something to think about of pinching is that it's a bit of an energy sink. Because when the tree is putting out a new flush of growth, it's spending all the sugars it's saved up from its previous flush into growing new foliage. This new foliage is not yet very productive. It's not photosynthesizing and paying back the tree yet. So if you go ahead on most tree species and you pull off every new piece of growth that the tree is giving you, the tree will weaken that year, and over time it's going to die, right? Because if it spends sugars, it doesn't get paid back. You take it out. You take out that new growth and you do it again and again. The old foliage is it's gonna expire after a few years, and then the tree has no more new foliage year after year to kind of sustain itself. So one of the reasons we leave behind some new growth is that we need some new growth always to be on the tree and to mature to carry the tree forward, right? So pinching. You can over pinch, and you do not want to remove all the new foliage when you do pinch. Yes, sir.
Wouldn't that happen on back budding? You get new, after you pinch that off, it's going to back bud down the branch and you're still going to get your new growth, right?
Yeah. Yes. Yeah. So, I mean, that's true. Potentially, if you just you took everything cleanly off the silhouette and you didn't touch the back buds, you're going to get net positive growth for that flush. So it's a bit of a balancing act. You could also leave foliage behind, but if you pinch too aggressively, there could just be not enough new growth left behind to offset the old foliage the tree is shedding. So I think leaving some growth behind is a bit of a kind of a approximate best practice, right? To make sure you're leaving some new growth on the tree. But also, if you're leaving new growth behind, the tree is going to set buds. It's going to set buds where you pinch, and the tree is kind of better able to set buds in the leaf axils of the new growth than the old growth, probably. So, if you're in particular, if you're trying to get the tree to set buds where you want it to set buds, you would leave some of that old growth behind, just so you leave new growth for the buds to set. But that's a good point. All right, let's go on to like when you pinch, right? So that's the tree on the left. This is what it looked like at the start of spring, right? So someone asked the question, well, when can I start pinching? How early, right? So the tree is this is the tree just starting to push, right? This is the exciting time of spring where trees light up. I find redwoods actually start in my backyard pretty late. And in fact, I find my redwoods quite, to behave quite differently based on their individual cultivation situation. For example, if you look at the three trees I have on the table, the tree on the right is like just putting out a really small flush right now. You can see the tips are green and there's a little bit of extension. The tree in the middle has been flushing out for like the past 2 months. You know, it hasn't really stopped yet. And the tree on the left, its buds are lit up, but it's not extending, right? So they're kind of all at different points of the process, and you have to read each individual tree to figure out what to do. So the short answer is that this picture is too early, right? First off, if I pinch some of this growth off, like these really small shoots, I'm leaving really small leaves behind. Like basically, like it's like not leaving any of the leaves behind, right? And the tree hasn't really really something I'm thinking about is like what does the foliage I'm leaving behind look like? Also, because I a lot of times I pinch to balance energy on the tree. At this point in time, I don't really know what's stronger and what's weaker yet. You know, all the shoots are barely emerging. So I'll give you some examples here. This is the tree in the middle, a maybe, you know, probably 3 weeks into its first flush. And I'm starting to see some of these buds take on more energy than other buds, right? So if you look at what I chose to pinch, I'm pinching some of these. I think this shoot right here, shoots like this. This is the bare minimum kind of threshold for when I would pinch. And again, it might depend on the tree. If the tree is really weak, you might not even pinch it. If the tree is really weak, it's recovering from being weak, and you start pinching it, maybe you're gonna let it, you know, grow a bit bigger or longer before you pinch. Yes, sir.
When you pinch those lighter leaves, they're the young buds, right?
Yes.
When you pinch, do you pull that whole leaf off?
No, so
Will you-
I'm leaving a few pairs of leaves behind, maybe 2 to 3 pairs of leaves. So I'm gonna go back to that previous picture. You'll notice that's that full shoot I was pinching, and I'm leaving this kind of little bit behind.
Okay,
So
thank you.
yes. Whoops. So if you just notice what I pinched over here, I'm not, you know, I'm pinching these guys, which are clearly getting a head start, right? But I'm not pinching these shoots up in the back. Like some of these shoots that are just emerging that are shorter, I'm not pinching yet. I would expect that after that first pinch, the tree is going to put more energy into those shoots. They're going to get ahead. And once those shoots get to that kind of past that threshold of where I'm going to pinch again, and that's going to encourage the tree to put more energy into the weaker shoots. So again, another example, I'm pinching these guys all the way at the end of the silhouette that have just started to extend and just started to, you know, develop a reasonable leaf size. But, you know, this piece here, borderline. This piece, too small. This piece, too small. These two pieces, too small. Even though I know that I'm eventually going to pinch this piece, like it's all the way out in the exterior of the silhouette, I'm going to wait a little bit and I'm going to phase my pinching out. And over time, after 3-4 rounds of pinching, that's what my flush of growth looked like, right? And that's because I'm using pinching again to balance the energy of the tree. At this point, when you get to this level of even growth, one, your tree is probably already pretty refined, right? But at this point, you can come in and start pinching all these pieces fairly evenly. But it does matter, I think, kind of waiting for those weaker shoots to catch up. So, and all these pictures are that tree in the middle there, this past spring. You would not expect to see this even a flush of growth, say, on the tree all the way on the right. That is in a much earlier phase of development. As you get more and more shoots, you get more and more control of the tree, and you can kind of balance the tree like this, and that's when redwoods start getting fun and very tedious. Cool. So more pictures here, just the response to pinching. I mentioned that where you leave the new growth behind, you can expect the tree to set buds. You can see that these 3 tips are pinched, and you can see, if you look carefully in these leaf axils, the tree is setting a whole bunch of buds, right? Oh, those buds are being kind of activated. You can see that here as well. Let's keep going. But the tips of where you pinch are not the only place the tree is going to set buds. Like I said, if you're pinching all the way out the tip over here, the tree is going to be encouraged to activate buds further behind. So if you look at this branch that I initially wired in a previous styling that was fairly bare, these are all leaf axils. There used to be leaves over here, and over time those fall off as the tree gets as the branch gets woody, but all these buds are activated by that pinching action. So don't think of, for me, I don't think of pinching just as a way to set buds on the tips, but also a way to encourage back budding, right? We had a question somewhere? Yes, sir. Will they back bud onto the trunk is the question. Yes, they absolutely do back bud in the trunk. So redwoods, okay, there are two parts to this. If the tree is already producing growth at some point off the trunk, right, you have a branch there, it most definitely is going to back bud again at that same point in the trunk, in that kind of junction where the trunk meets the branch. You're going to see a ton of buds. The tree is always going to want to put buds, new buds there, and when you're as you're developing your redwoods, you're going to have to rub those off because you don't need them. If a tree previously had a branch somewhere and you cut it off, you can count on that tree wanting to bud back at that point as well. But if you have an old trunk and there's a point in the trunk where you want to branch, but you've never seen a bud there before, it will probably not bud there again. There's at some point the tree has decided which spots on its, on the trunk or any kind of woody piece of tissue it's going to bud on, and when it's not. The younger that piece of tissue is, the more likely you're going to get buds. Oh yeah. Oh yeah. In fact, Bob Scheinman collects these with like no foliage at all. Not something I recommend doing yourself. Don't take a bonsai and cut everything off. But if you did and the tree was built up enough, the tree will probably bud at every point at which you made that cut. So redwoods are pretty fantastic that way. Question. Yeah, question is, do I find that that budding back happens less on a more refined tree? Yes. And I think the reason is that as it gets more and more refined, the extent to which we have to cut the tree back and pinch the tree back is less and less. And I think the less severe the foliage reduction of your actions, the less likely the tree is going to bud back all the way back on the trunk. So you will notice that less and less over time, yes. And also as the tissue matures, at some point I think the tree gets it, or some parts of the tree start losing, kind of gradually reduce in their budding potential, I think, on the older parts of the tree. Okay, so yep, budding back on this piece of tissue. Again, you'll notice that all these junctions, I mean, I already had a branch here. Gosh, it's going to set another bud. At every junction, those branch junctions are hot spots for budding. All right. Can we go? Can I do one more section, or should we? Okay, awesome. All right. So we just talked about pinching. Now we're going to talk about pruning. So again, I said pinching is not really about the way you remove the foliage. If there's no problem with pinching using scissors. In fact, sometimes I do enjoy pinching using scissors, because if I had some fine wire in the branches and I didn't want to bump those out of position by pulling out the foliage, sometimes scissors kind of really helps me do something, do that operation a bit more precisely. Actually, before I move into this, I'm going to pinch one piece of foliage on this tree just to demonstrate my point, right? This tree has still been flushing out, and I haven't touched it for probably about 3 weeks because I've been busy. But on a refined tree like this, I, at this point in time, will be looking for any pieces of growth that have gone past the intended silhouette, right? This tree's style has been set many times. I recently rewired it, and it's pretty obvious to me that this piece over here has extended quite a bit beyond the silhouette. I'm going to use scissors now just to keep it to make it easier, but I'm going to pinch this back actually over here and leave a bit of that new foliage behind. Yes. Sure. Okay, no worries. This will mostly be PowerPoint. This is just a really quick demo for people in the room. Other than that, I mean, I'm going to look through the tree more carefully when I get home, but there's not much else to pinch on this tree. Like every other extended piece of growth, I've already pinched it. I'm looking at two more over here. I'm going to pinch these. And maybe some of this, right? But these are really minute actions I'm going to take over here. Pinch, pinch, pinch. I'm guessing this is the last flush. And last year, I didn't see a flush this late. I suspect it's this year's weather conditions, and also the fact that I've really pumped this tree up with fertilizer this year. So if it's healthy, it's going to do that. All right, cool. Let's talk about pruning. So pruning, actually, Pruning, something we definitely do with scissors. So when I say pruning, I'm talking about when you come in to a tree where the flush of growth has hardened off and you're using scissors to remove foliage, right? We're all familiar with this operation. So if you look at a branch like this, that is a fully hardened off piece of growth, right? All the leaves are uniform dark brown. The tree is probably waxy to the touch, not quite as cool. And this is when you might come in and prune basically to kind of prune the shoot back to some leaves that are further back on that shoot. Pruning is what happens post-flush. There's going to be a point in time, actually that tree in the middle is reaching that point when the new growth is still lighter than the old growth, but when you tug at it, it's going to start getting, it's going to feel, the foliage is going to detach less easily, and you can see that gradual transition of color. When the tree hits that point, I typically back off for a bit and let the tree really harden off. And then when it hardens off, I come back in with scissors and make some cuts. So early on, we talked about pinching, leaving the new growth behind, but just pulling back, preventing those new pieces from extending. Pinching, we're kind of conservative, right? The gentleman here have asked why the top is so bushy right now and why I haven't really addressed that. I'm not coming in to clarify and reduce the amount of foliage in the top of the tree during the flush. The tree is naturally going to activate a lot of back buds, a lot more buds than I need during that flush. And if I come in and remove all that foliage during the flush, typically that is a bit too aggressive for a tree to handle during the flush of growth. Again, during the flush of growth, the tree is in a bit of an energy deficit, right? It's spending a lot of energy putting out this new foliage that is unproductive. When you wait until the tree has hardened off, that new foliage is by that point in time is already paying the tree back in sugars by being hardened off, losing less water, photosynthesizing a bit more efficiently. So it's really about timing. So I'm not trying to remove shoots, remove junctions that I don't need during the flush when I'm pinching. I'm doing that later when I'm pruning. So a really important thing you're doing when you're pruning is, one, getting into precise length adjustments, right? In pinching, ideally you pinch once to the exact length that you want and you don't have to touch it again. But if you did have to touch it again later, you can when it comes time to prune. But what's really important for me is that pinch stops that piece from elongating anymore, so the tree can allocate resources to other pieces that it's not putting in energy into. Later on, you can more precisely fine tune the length using pruning. Something else you're doing during pruning that's really important is shoot selection. Kind of like in black pines, right? You decandle black pine, what happens? At every decandle site, you get 1, 2, sometimes 5 shoots, right? And in the long term, in almost any bonsai, basically any bonsai, you want a bifurcating branch structure, right? You want shoots to divide into 2s and to 4s and to 8s and so on and so forth. You don't want 3s, you don't want 4s. And anyone who's had a redwood knows that they give you like 8 shoots, right? Whenever you pinch, especially when the tree's really happy. You need to come in then and then choose the 2 shoots out of the 8, that you want to keep. So you keep the tree moving forward. So that shoot selection and that clarification of the branch structure, removing all those buds you don't need, that's a really important operation to perform, right? Because you're setting the tree up for the next flush when you want the tree to invest energy in all those shoots that you left behind. Typically, after you perform this operation, you may be taking off in early stages of development more than 50% of the foliage off the tree, because the tree is going to give you a lot of shoots you can't use. It's going to send shoots coming down. It's going to send whorls of 6 in one spot. It's going to activate a bunch of buds in the junctions of branches that you've already set that you're going to use, right? So you're going to remove all of those during the pruning phase. One more interesting thing here to note about pruning is that when you prune to the middle of a shoot after the flush has hardened off, you are less likely to get buds where you cut, right? As compared to pinching, if this was a soft, fleshy shoot and I pinched it right here, I'm very likely going to get buds around here. If I do it when the flush is hardened off, it's a bit of a dice roll, and there's a timing mechanism here. Typically, if you cut, I would say, either post flush when the tree has just hardened off from a flush, or when you see the tree setting buds, when you see the buds swelling on the tree. At those 2 points in time when you cut, there's a much higher chance you're going to get buds at your cut site, right? And this is useful in the earlier stages when you're developing the tree, right? When you have long, I'm trying to think of an example here. Well, this tree is starting to get more and more refined, but if this was hypothetically a first styling of this branch, and I had this long piece over here, and I wanted to branch this short. Well, I have nothing here. All the ramification, all the divisions are out here. I might want to make a cut right here and hope for buds, right? And so I need to choose my time of year to make this cut so that I'm more likely to get buds over here. Otherwise, I'm just going to have to start over on this branch, right? So if you're in a situation there where you need to make these cuts into the middle of long leggy fronds, you want to do it at that right time. And hey, let's be real. There are times we just miss some pinching, right? Like you might have gone on vacation or whatever, and you have a long shoot. So you essentially want the same response you would get from pinching while pruning. So to achieve that, you would have to kind of prune at the right time. Let's look at a few pictures. Question? Yes.
When you're starting from a like say nursery stock and it's the first time you're doing it, would you just go straight to pruning, or would you still do the pinching first and then prune like you would later?
Yeah, that's a great question. I'm going to cover this a little bit later in development strategy, but the short answer, again, the question is, do you go straight to pinch? Do you prune first or you pinch first when you start on a fresh tree, right? Nursery stock, whatever. I typically would be styling and pruning the tree first. Pinching is like a fine-tuning operation, right? So pruning and wiring for me comes first, and I'll talk a bit about that later. But yeah, that's me, and this is interesting discussion. All right, let's look at this picture over here. This is an example of a bunch of branches you might want to prune, right? And so again, if for whatever reason this tree got away, actually a lot of my trees got away from me during the year I was getting my home renovated. I moved out. Most of my trees are at Peter T's. I can only go up once or twice, and these trees are flushing out like 4 to 6 times a year, right? So I ended up with a whole bunch of branches like this that I had to cut back, right? So this is a cut I might want to make. This is a cut I might want to make. This is a cut I might want to make, and I really hope I get buds at those cut sites, right? Because these branches are way beyond the silhouette I was looking for. And while the tree actually naturally will give you nice bifurcating growth, it doesn't always do it where you want it to, right? If you notice, there's this long inner node here of no divisions, and then a whole bunch of wonderful divisions, right? And you'd love if those divisions started from back here. So that's when pruning comes into play. So let's look at some pictures here. So these are various pictures of how you might spot the signs for when it's a good time to prune. So I had mentioned that if you wait till the tree is setting buds, when the buds are swelling, that's typically a sign that the tree is kind of actively setting buds. And so it might respond to your prune by setting buds as well. I'm just showing you a few pictures here of, actually, you know what? These are probably prunes that have succeeded. So let's look at this over here. So you see how these buds are nice and fat and lit up? These are actually pictures of the short stout tree on the left, maybe about a month ago. It still kind of looks like that, which is weird. But when you see all these buds swelling and about ready to go, you typically also see the buds on the trunk, where you have those pesky buds you don't need. You're going to see those setting as well and kind of wanting to start growing. This is a great time to prune, right? Because the tree is setting buds. And if you make cuts into the middle of long, leggy pieces like that, you see how there's a bud right here? You see how there are buds. Okay, well, this tree is setting buds along this prune piece. And even these scraggly pieces have the potential to set buds where you cut them if you cut at the right time. So that's more examples of that response to pruning. Something else about pruning, when you're developing redwoods early on, Dodie had mentioned that redwoods sometimes just shed branches. You don't know why, they just shed branches, right? I don't quite know why they do that too, but the redwoods have a way of very rapidly reallocating their resources when they don't find a branch productive. And oftentimes they will give you a new branch exactly where the other branch began. So if you look at this branch here, looking kind of scraggly, not particularly vibrant, a new branch, it budded back at the base of that kind of junction, right? And it gave me a new, really productive branch. You can see the same thing happening here. This scraggly guy is getting shed or getting deprioritized, and a new bud is being set over here. Same examples back here. So it is often the times in the development process where you just have to replace a branch you thought you needed, a shoot that you thought you needed, with another shoot. You might uncoil the wire from that piece that you had wired out, cut that off, and put the wire in that new shoot and put it back in place. So you'll have to do this less and less over time, but this is a very normal part of the process. They just do that. And so a few more examples here. Look, I wired out this piece. I really loved it. Did not quite work out. Got a little bit sunburned. I got another great piece right here, right? Same for this same for, and this is a new shoot. I'm looking at this piece here, which is not bad, but this piece is better. And so oftentimes when you come in and prune and you make those selections, you have to decide among a few different options that the tree is giving you. What you don't want to do, however, in the long term is to always be doing this. If you're finding yourself replacing the same branch again and again and again, there's probably something else going on in cultivation that's not quite right, and your tree is never going to quite progress. Hope that makes sense. Yes, sir. Yes.
Started to elongate. I think they can hear me.
I'll repeat the question.
Yeah, so is it more advantageous to cut off the weaker branches so the energy can come into the newer ones?
So the question was, when I see a situation like this, when a branch is being shed or deprioritized, should I cut off? Is it advantageous to cut off the whole weak branch and then give energy to the new bud? For me, I typically wait until this new bud has emerged and has gotten a certain length before I replace it. If anything, for the aesthetics of that current iteration, I don't think leaving that weak branch on there is going to be a huge impediment to this shoot developing. And I want to give this branch a chance to succeed. You know, if it's going to bud a little bit later, or if it's going to come back, I don't want to lose this woody piece of, you know, the woody tissue over here if I don't have to. So I cut it off when I have the replacement, not in anticipation of it, if that makes sense.
Yeah, what about the opposite? If you want to maybe try to save that branch that's looking a little sorry, would you pinch off that bud and try to redirect more energy to the existing branch?
You know, when a branch is looking scraggly like this, and I see this bud at the base, the tree is kind of telling me what it wants to do. And I generally assume that this branch is probably a goner. Again, in this particular situation, because this bud has not yet emerged, what I would probably do is not scrub off this bud and then see what happens. You know, 9 times out of 10 for me, this bud just gives me a better and more ramified piece of growth. Even if this branch stays on, like, this piece will tend to have more divisions and more health than this existing piece, and I'm almost always going to choose this piece if I can. So it's a really common situation, though. Hope that makes sense. Yes, almost time. Okay. I'll just talk about one more thing very quickly, and then we'll stop. The very last technique that I'll briefly mention is, like with black pines, I also use sacrifice branches, like in that tree on the right. Who's familiar with the concept of sacrifice branches? Okay, cool, great, right? So in short, what we're doing is we're leaving a shoot that we're eventually going to cut off. We're leaving it there to kind of thicken all the tissue behind it, whether it's a branch, a trunk, and so on. And sometimes when you have a piece of material that just has shoots off a piece of wood, shoots off a trunk, shoots off a burl, you want to thicken a branch, you might selectively leave a piece, let it run for 1 or 2 years before cutting it back off. Works really well with redwoods. They thicken up really fast. My only advice there is two things. One, like a black pine, I trim off a lot of these shoots coming off that sacrifice branch, and I leave all the ramification on the tip so that I don't shade any of the kind of the branches I actually want to keep, right? And the other thing is that you probably want to plan ahead and figure out where you're going to make that cut on your sacrifice branch. I made a small mistake here where this apical area on this tree, which is very underdeveloped right now, I had just removed the sacrifice branch. I probably made maybe this the sacrifice branch. Like there's a much longer piece coming out, and I cut it back here. But because I cut it back here, this section got thickened up quite a bit as well, and I actually didn't want it quite this thick. On hindsight, I might have left another piece popping out from over here to be the sacrifice branch, right? So I could keep this section a bit thinner. So you always kind of want to anticipate where you're going to cut the sacrifice branch. Otherwise, you're going to cut back to a point where you've left the kind of chunky stub, and you're going to ruin the transition of taper on that fine branch, right? So think maybe 3 steps ahead when you're doing sacrifice branches.
You have sacrifice branches on on the tree on the right, all the major branches. Did you end up using sacrifice branches to thicken those up?
Makes sense. The question is on the tree on the right, did I have sacrifice branches on every primary branch in the tree? Short answer is yes, I have pictures of it. And I recently cut off maybe half of them during this past growing season. All right, I think the technique section is done. Shall we take a break for show and tell? Okay, well, thanks for coming back. I promise we'll get to more pictures soon. We just have one more section of text. All right, so let's see. And we have the screen sharing and everything, the presenting up. Actually, if you want to, I'll wait till you get that. Actually, if you just back out of the slideshow and then share my screen. Oh, you are screen sharing. Oh, it is shared? Okay, great. Oh, perfect. All right. All right, so before we get into case studies, I just wanted to quickly talk about kind of the big picture plan for how I recommend, or like, ways to develop a redwood, right? I think there are 2 broad ways I've seen people have success of developing redwoods. I categorize them as building the tree either kind of inside out or outside in. So when I say inside out, I kind of refer to a strategy where, you kind of restart the tree from its trunk, right? You grow the tree from fine shoots, and you primarily pinch to build divisions in your branches, and you kind of grow the tree gradually outwards, like you would, many deciduous trees that you're growing from scratch, or even, I'm thinking of field-grown black pines. It's a very similar kind of strategy where you early on you embed a lot of divisions into the branches. You get a lot of usable divisions, and you selectively thicken some branches. I think this is a pretty popular strategy, and I've seen many kind of refined trees built in this way. Has anyone kind of built redwoods in this style, in this way? Right? And it's worked pretty well for you? Yeah, so I don't do this, but I've seen it be quite successful. And so I just wanted to call that out as one strategy you might use to build redwoods. I think oh. Oh, I see. Okay, let's see. Testing. Is it any better? Okay, cool. Sorry about that. Did you guys get most of what I said just now about building trees this way? I think the reason you can build redwoods in this particular way is because redwoods are very vigorous, and they can store a lot of energy in their tissue, such that when you cut off a lot of foliage, it can actually have the capacity to back bud kind of very strongly in old wood. You couldn't use the strategy for other kinds of conifers that are not quite as vigorous, do not move that much water, and do not have the ability to kind of be cut back that heavily. But I think redwood is kind of one of the more, one of the species that can kind of take that kind of stress and kind of respond quite well to it. So I kind of think of the way I build redwoods and really most of my conifers as like an outside-in approach. And by that, I mean that I, early on in the development process, set the style of the tree and set the desired shape and size of the canopy that I want. And then using pinching, what I'm really trying to do, primarily, it's not to really divide the shoots and kind of build divisions on the exterior of the canopy, but I'm actually trying to limit the creep of the expansion of the canopy and encourage buds further in on the tree to set and develop. So in this kind of strategy, when I'm pinching, if you look at the tree all the way on the right over there, that's maybe the third wiring. So this tree is still early on in the process. I'll show you pictures of this tree later on, but initially when you set the tree, it's a bit of a skeleton, doesn't have much going on, and you start pinching all these tips. The tree responds usually by sending a whole bunch of shoots out on this bare branch, right? And you're getting divisions, or you're getting kind of secondary branches where you didn't have them. Those are not branches I'm going to pinch, not yet. I'm letting those grow out until they hit the desired length, my kind of target length for those branches, and then I'm pinching them. And then by doing that, I encourage more back budding to happen behind that. And by doing that again and again and again, I build more and more options behind the kind of the initial superficial silhouette, and I get a denser and denser and more kind of complex tree. Over time, the initial, say, exterior pads that I set in my first design may actually be cut off as I get more and more divisions and better development behind it. I might cut it back to shorten the tree and compact the tree over time. But this is how I build my redwoods. And if you think about it, it's typically how you build like a collected conifer, say, or a pine, a collected pine especially. You kind of work with what you have, and then you use these pinching techniques, pruning techniques, and so on to cultivate more and more ramification inside the tree, and then you eventually kind of replace worse options with better options over time. And I found that I've actually been able to develop pretty good trees pretty fast using this technique. So I do think it's a bit faster in that I don't have to regrow all my branches, but I am, I will be using a bunch of branches or setting a bunch of pads that I may eventually, over the course of 3 to 6 years, be replacing and cutting back to. And that's really part of the process. And I'll show you some examples over time. So I tried to draw up like a rough game plan of how, what I would do, but this is just a rough guide, right? So it's a starting point for discussion, and we can discuss why we do these operations right now. So let's take a hypothetical year 1. Let's say it's now, right? This is year 1, and you bought a piece of raw material. You got that tree right over there from the raffle, which you should buy tickets for, or you go up to Bob Scheinman's, you buy a piece of material. Typically, the first thing I do is that the next spring, right, the next repotting season, so, that's only a few months away from now, but if you bought this in the summer, you'd be waiting for at least about half a year. I repot first. Why would I repot first? Strength, building strength, health. Roots, okay, building up the root strength, health of the tree. Makes sense. Those all make sense, right? The initial repot typically will reinvigorate, will kind of set the tree up for more health and more success. I say this with a caveat in that if you bought a tree that wasn't quite that healthy yet, repotting may not be the move. In general, if you have a weak tree, messing with its roots is usually, it may not be productive. It may actually be more stressful to the tree than is productive. So if you bought a tree that, from the looks of it, might just have only put on 1 flush of growth this past year, right? It may just have started flushing. I would say in Bob's, when I bought some trees from Bob, maybe, when he collected them, they had no foliage on them. And then this past year, they put on their first flush of foliage. For trees like that, I might even wait an additional year so the tree has more time to build up a bit more energy so I can actually come in for the repot. Another reason to repot is also to kind of really expose what's in there. Sometimes, a lot of times when you buy these redwoods, they're buried a bit further up than than is ideal, right? There's more interest hidden inside the tree, and if that's the case, like revealing all that nabari or whatever other interesting features is going to influence your design, right, later on. I find this is common with redwoods, whereas if you're buying, say, a collected juniper, for example, depending on the collector, probably what you see is what you get if you're buying from a good collector, and you may go ahead and style first in that case. But I find a lot of redwoods, just by nature of how they're collected, you may not be seeing all the value in the tree immediately. And usually you're going to be pleasantly surprised. If you look at that tree all the way there on the right, when I had bought it, the tree was like here. So I was very pleasantly surprised when I dug deeper. And even now the moss has kind of creeped up on it a little bit, but that tree has a really powerful base. Didn't change my design, but it was pretty cool. Okay, so you repot it, you built strength. You notice that between repot and first styling, there is a whole year of a gap, right? In general, for almost any species, really, I typically space out repot and my first initial kind of heavy foliage reduction, heavy styling. I separate those by a year. I don't do those at the same time. For most trees, I don't ask a lot of the canopy of the tree and the roots at the same time, right? If there's going to be a lot of foliar reduction, I probably leave roots so that the tree can recover from that operation. Vice versa, the tree, if I'm gonna damage or cut a lot of roots in a repot that's gonna downsize the container quite a bit, then I want a lot of foliage on the tree so that it can quickly, that can fuel root growth post repot. And I want a whole year for this to happen. So that's why we have this additional year. And after that, we do that first styling, right? So that's when we do everything we just talked about. We would be waiting either for, I think, the early spring or late winter. There's usually a time in that period where the tree is, the buds are swelling. It's about to push. That's a good time to, be able to make cuts into the middle of these long fronds, right? And typically on that first styling, you're going to have a tree that, looks a bit more like the tree all the way in the back over there that just has these long wild pieces because you've let it, grow wild for a year, right? And you're going to have to lay them in position and cut them to length. And ideally, you want to be able to control where those buds are going to form, right? So do it at that time of year. If you do it outside these ideal windows for pruning, typically when you cut and if you don't get a bud at the cut site, what happens is the tree buds all the way back at that junction like we discussed, right? So you might end up having to regrow a bunch of pieces that the tree just decided to shed. So choosing that timing is pretty important. I would say, fall or spring tends to be a good timing for this first styling. After that first styling, I was asked the question before: do you immediately go to pinching, or do you lean on pruning? So during the first styling itself, obviously I'm leaning on pruning because I'm not doing a first styling while the tree is putting out a flush, right? That would be bad because you'd be producing a lot of foliage while the tree is actually in an energy deficit. After that first styling, I actually let the tree blow out for a little bit. Like I give it at least half a year of uninterrupted growth. Because don't forget, pinching is it's a refinement operation. It slows the tree down. It takes energy out of the system. But after that first styling, typically you want the tree to thicken. You want the tree to set those, the significant bends you put into them, whatever it is, the primary branches, so on. You want thickening of the low branches. And you want the tree to accumulate enough energy so that it's vigorous enough that it's going to set a lot more back buds. So for at least that first 6 months, I'm not going to pinch it. I'm going to leave at least 1 or 2 flushes with no pinching and then only come in post flush and prune it. That way I just let the tree build up a bit more energy. Because like I said, if you're pinching, you're just taking energy out of the system during that flush, right? And then let's see, so I'll prune in that first fall, like half a year later, following which the next spring, maybe after that first pruning, that's when I might start pinching, right? Depending on the form of the tree. And then at some point, the wire comes off because the wire starts biting in. You come in again on a second styling. Again, you prune, this time probably in the summer or fall, earlier in the year. And then you start your pinching and refinement process where you're doing that process that I just described, where you control the elongation of the expansion of the silhouette beyond your target silhouette, and you foster better and better pieces behind the tips of these branches. Does that kind of make sense? Again, this whole schedule is like subject to change depending on the health of the tree. So for some folks that came up and looked at my trees just now, I pointed out that the short stubby tree on the left, it actually hasn't had shoot selection done to it yet. So if you look at the tips, there are a whole bunch of whorls of 3 to 5 branches that are still 3 to 5 shoots that are still there on the branch tips. that I actually need to select down to 2. There's a whole bunch of shoots I don't need, a few things that are growing off the trunk that I need to take off. I haven't done that for that tree, not because I've been lacking time, but because I actually want to let that tree build up a bit more energy. So I noticed, oh, you know, if you looked at that tree, you notice that it has really small leaves, like pretty small leaves for a redwood, and the leaf size has been going down progressively over the past 2 years, but especially in the past year. I've also noticed that the flushes have gotten shorter and not quite as basically it hasn't been pushing as much on each flush, and each flush is lasting for a shorter amount of time. And come this fall, I noticed that the tree has been, you know, the buds have been swelling, but it hasn't really been elongating. Only a few shoots elongated, and they didn't really even fully open up. So what that's saying to me is that the tree doesn't have that much energy in the system, not that much fuel in the tank, right? And so if I were to come in again and do all that pinching and do all that pruning and take off a whole bunch of foliage, the tree is going to have less foliage to kind of accumulate sugars and starches with, right? And so to give this tree a bit of a break, I'm not pinching, I'm not pruning, and I'm going to wait till the early spring when it's about to push again to do all that work, right? So between now and the early spring, even though it's a bit of a low season for the tree, it can have a bit more extra foliage on it to kind of build a bit more of its energy stores for that flush next year. So whenever you see, you know, I think I've also noticed this for that tree in the middle that I showed the first Pacific Bonsai Expo. After the expo, the tree was weak for about, it was already weakening, and the next year it was like very weak. And I just gave it 2 years off because I think I might have controlled it a bit too much that year. I think I pinched every single flush. After every single flush, I came in and pruned, and I did it again and again and again. And I think over time, the tree's energy system just, you know, its bank started shrinking and shrinking, and it eventually went into a deficit. So there is such a thing as pinching and pruning too much. And sometimes you might want to, you know, give the tree at least 6 months, a year to just flush out a little bit and come in at the right time of year to prune and kind of regain the form of that tree. Because you can send a tree downhill if you control it too much. Does that make sense? So, you know, you would adjust your schedule just based on your read on the tree.
Yeah, a couple questions. If you're gonna do a trunk chop, where would you put that in the game plan? And then also your first repot, how aggressive can you be in reducing the root ball? If you're going from like a 5-gallon container to a nursery container, how much can you reduce that?
Cool. 2 questions there. One, when will I do a trunk chop? I think about that for redwoods similar to how I would think about basically most bonsai trees. If you're going to make a very major move where you're going to reduce a lot of foliage and you want the tree to respond with a lot of vigor, you typically want to do that when the tree has stocked up a lot of sugars, right? So the worst time to do that would be in the middle of the spring as the tree is putting out a new flush, right? The tree has just dumped a bunch of sugar in the new foliage, hasn't gotten it back. The time when the tree is most stocked up on sugars is if it has just had a growing season, not being touched, no pruning. In the early spring, right before it pushes, it basically has had maybe a half a year, a whole, you know, since the fall began, like when it's just basically stocking up on sugars. I'll back up by saying that most trees approximately in the spring, they're spending a lot more energy than they're accumulating. And in the fall, they start stocking up. And every year you have this cycle, right? Energy spent, energy regain. And, you know, it's a bit more granular than that, right? Because trees put on foliage in the fall as well. But that's a simplified model. So if you give a tree a break for a whole year, pre-spring flush is when the tree is going to have the most energy, right? So that's that's one really good opportunity. The other good time is probably in the early fall. That's another good first styling time. So the short answer is whenever it's a good time for first styling timing kind of lines up with trunk chop timing, right? Like it's major foliage reduction timing, early fall or early spring, but look for the signs. Make sure the tree its buds are swelling. I think the redwoods tend not to respond very well if you do major work when the tree is kind of inactive, and they do shut down for a bit in the winter. So for me in San Francisco, and this is probably going to be different for you folks in Sacramento, my redwoods stop growing like pretty late in the season, but they start pretty late as well. My redwoods might not start moving till May, which is strange. But your results may vary. Kind of your tree may behave differently based on the climate. The second question was Remind me again. Oh yeah, I don't think there's a particular limitation if with like redwoods aren't particularly root sensitive. Again, as long as you're not doing major work on the canopy that same year, you can be fairly aggressive on the roots. In general, if you are downsizing a container, my advice is that on that downsizing operation, you try to cut as few roots off as possible to maximize survivability, right? So if you're having the container size, you don't necessarily have to cut off half the roots. You can kind of remove the soil from the roots and kind of work them into the new container for that transition repot. So you have as many roots as possible for the tree to recover. And then on subsequent repots where you're basically taking it out and putting it back in the same container, that's when you can be a bit more aggressive on the root pruning to kind of take off leggy roots and encourage finer roots. So if you follow that principle, you know, I've had no problems whatsoever reducing a container size by, say, 50%, like half. I'm pretty sure you could go more as well. Hope that answers your question. I don't really have like a, I haven't really had to push a redwood super far in terms of container reduction because the guy I get my redwoods from, Bob, tends to put them in reasonable size containers. So I've never really had to shrink them down more than half, if that makes sense. Yeah, and if it was a major reduction you had to do, you could just do, you could go down by half and maybe 2 successive years in a row if you don't prune the foliage at all, you know? So hope that answers your question. Cool. Dodie, you had a question.
Yes, I recently got a tree from Bob that he collected 10 months ago and had no foliage on it when he collected it, and it's got lots of runners, lots of shoots. Is it safe to repot it now in this winter? He said it is, but it makes me nervous.
Yeah, I know he gives that advice, and I think he's more experienced at recovering redwoods than I am. I would probably err on the side of caution and wait another year. One thing I do know about redwoods is that, they can have a lot of energy stocked up that allows them to put out a flush, but I have seen some redwoods, that have some kind of underlying health condition decline after putting out that flush. And so just because you see a flush, it might not mean that the tree is in the clear, You might see the health problem later on. So if you give it another year, you can, let's say in the worst case, your tree actually had really little roots or like really unhealthy roots that is not ready for repot. You might not see it yet, and then you pull out the container and you worsen that condition, right? That's how I think about it. And I guess the other thing I think about is, based on the current soil mix that it's in, can the tree tide itself over on that soil mix for another year, right? And if that soil mix is not criminally bad, it's probably safer to wait. That's my guess. But if it's a really bad soil mix, super compacted, water doesn't get through, you clean the top and that doesn't address the issue, then maybe that's the lesser of evils. And if you do that, I would be extremely careful and actually try not to touch the existing roots at all. Just loosen up the margins in the bottom and pot it in a bigger container where there's good soil on the perimeter that the roots can escape to. That would be the most conservative way to approach it, I think. But maybe listen to Bob. Any other questions? This is all theory. I think it'll make more sense with the pictures. It'll look better, more interesting. All right, let's go to case studies. This is exciting. So that's the redwood on the left over there. This redwood actually took a bit more time to develop than ideal because I had this year where I couldn't work on it. But I initially got it like this. This was from Bob Scheinman. This was my initial styling. Actually, for reasons I don't fully understand yet, on the first 2 times I styled the tree, a lot of the tree died back. So either my wiring is really bad or the timing was wrong. But this is the only tree I've ever seen that happen with. I didn't take a picture of it dying back because that doesn't look good. So but that's why there's this 2-year gap between these two. But let's just imagine that this went well. This is what would have happened after that first styling. So you'd notice that in that first styling, I'm selecting just a few pieces of primary structure that I want, or I'm wiring it out. I'm defining the angle and the approximate size of the canopy, but I really don't have very much to work with here. And who knows, maybe it's because I didn't repot it first. Could be. So the tree responds and it kind of looks like this, right? And you can tell the tree has put on a lot more density with with pinching and pruning kind of applied over the past year. In a subsequent styling, this might have been the second or third time I wired the tree. You can tell that the tree's taken on a lot more form now. The primary lines, I've had to adjust some of the primary lines a little bit. This whole piece here didn't exist before. The tree gave it to me, in subsequent flushes, and I had to wire this down and this and that. But you can tell that the canopy is starting to be a lot more finished than before. I will say in this period of time, I also got a bit better at bonsai, so I was probably able to create a more beautiful canopy. After this styling, just about the next year, you can tell roughly the same bones, right? Using pinching to control the expansion of the canopy, getting a lot more density, but again, you're always going to have some of these long extensions. I typically, when the pinching season is over, or when the new shoots start being hard to pinch, I let the tree go until the foliage fully hardens off. So there's always going to be this period of time when it's just going to get a little bit more leggy than ideal. At this point, prune and yet another styling. So if you look between this and this, incremental progress, not a ton, but you can see there are more pads over here right now, more foliage filling in these areas than before. These were just, one or two green shoots, and now they're starting to have, it's starting to look more like a pad. Just about half a year later, after that spring flush, you can tell more deliberate pinching. This is looking a lot more refined. It's still very much on the way. This was this past year, and it's put on one more flush since then. But this tree is coming along. It's not quite in refinement yet. You can see that the apical area of the tree is kind of underdeveloped. Those shoots, those options kind of came a bit later, they're much further behind the kind of the lower branches, but we'll address this over time. So again, if you look at that tree in 2021, again, give me imagine I was a bit wiser, and this was 2 years after. Not too bad. Developed pretty quick. Also, this tree, I was telling some folks who came up before, again, I'm really kind of big on the downward branch structure for my conifers, and in this tree, I tried to be pretty deliberate about keeping those branch lines consistent. Cool. Next redwood number 1. So this tree over here is the tree in the middle when I bought it from the Bay Island Bonsai Club auction in 2018, very early on in my bonsai career. Someone had asked me why I carved the trunk that way. The answer is I didn't. I bought it this way. And I think someone probably had bought a piece of nursery stock. I'm guessing it's nursery stock. Who knows? And they carved it down in some carving project. Not something I would have done myself for a redwood, because you don't typically see a redwood of this much deadwood on it. But it was what it was, and I wanted a piece of material that had some potential to be an upright tree, and this was all I could find. I think it was $100, which was pretty good deal. I was bidding against one person in that auction, and I'm like, darn it, I want it. And the big problem with this tree is that all the foliage on the tree was coming out one side of the tree, the live side of the tree, and so I knew that was a problem that I had to address. So in that same year, I bought it during repotting season, so I repotted it into this low profile container you see it in now. And then I basically let it grow for that entire year. So what I described. So this is what happens when you leave the redwood. The redwood is healthy and you let it grow, right? Again, this was really early in my bonsai career. I think Peter T helped me with this initial styling, actually. And you'll see that we only set the primary structure on this tree. If I were to do it again, I would probably have wired the whole tree out. Also, to kind of get foliage on the right side of the tree, we swung a primary branch around the back to form the bones of a secondary apex. So if you see that second apex on the right side of the tree, this is what it began as, this little piece right here. If I was to design the tree again, I'd probably do it a bit differently. I probably would have committed to a tree that's more asymmetrical to the left. But I kind of ran with this design, and it's become better and better over time. So I think about 2019 is when I started committing to fully wiring this tree out. And the branch angles are still a bit soft on the tree back then, but you can tell this is kind of what I started with. And basically, this is what happened over that process over time, where I would pinch And then after the flush hardened off, I would prune and I would do it again and again and again, um, about twice a year. So you can see, if you look at the timestamps, you can see that I probably was doing these major kind of wire adjustments and pruning about twice a year. And so by April 2022, we got this form here, which is kind of an early version of the current form we see. And then that was that tree at the first Pacific Bonsai Expo. So from the first styling, that was October 2018 to this, it was about 4 years, which is pretty fast for a redwood. So again, not bad for actually less than 4 years. Thank you. And I actually recently, and then I gave it about a 2-year break actually after this show because it was weakening. And then recently I rewired it again and I pruned it. And I wish I could show you it freshly pruned because it looked great. Now it's flushing out again. And so it's a bit messy. But after it fully hardens off, I'm probably going to prune it in the early spring. So we're going to get that order again. But if you come up later and look at this tree, I think, between this picture and its current form, the branch pads have accrued a lot more maturity in them. And if you look from underneath, you're actually starting to see kind of the woody fingers of these branch pads kind of forming, which took a long time. So even though I managed to achieve the superficial, no, it's not superficial, this kind of canopy and shape pretty early on, the branch refinement process is something that is still a work in progress. And the tree can be a lot better in that sense. Here's another tree that I showed pictures of. Actually, that's the tree on the right. I bought this from Bob Scheinman like this. It was in a deep Anderson flat, so already a very reasonable size container. This here is my friend Eric Schrader. Y'all might know him from Bonsai and the Pacific Bonsai Expo. I recruited his help because he had an angle grinder and more experience with it, and I needed some help naturalizing this stump cut. So my first step with this tree was to both carve it and repot it because I knew the stump cut would require quite a bit of force and a mix of power tools and hand tools. And while the tree was healthy and in a plastic container, pretty good time to do that work. Once the tree gets into a ceramic container, you have to be a lot more careful of those, kind of breaking the pot or applying that kind of force to the tree. So did both those operations at once, made a kind of did some decent covering on the top, which I haven't really revisited since, and then let it grow out for a year. I did not manage to style this tree until 2024 because I was renovating my house and this sat at Peter T's for a bit, but this became a nice, healthy, gigantic bush. This is probably how you want your tree to look like before you do a big first styling. The first styling was fairly dramatic. I reduced a lot of the foliage. I was going for a kind of a single trunk formal upright of this. And you can tell very little foliage on the tree. I let it grow out for 1 season. Let's see, yes, about half a year. No pinching, just to let it accumulate some strength, like I recommended before. And then I came in again with the pruning and wire adjustments, and this time I left a whole bunch of sacrifice branches on it. Pretty much one for every major trunk, every major branch on the tree, because everything just looked a little too tiny relative to the thick trunk back then. So this past year, this was June. It blew out from that first after I set those sacrifice branches and I pruned it again. Still looking pretty skimpy. I repeated the same process again, just between June, and October. This was with very, very deliberate pinching, right? Where if you look back here, if you look back here, you'll see that there are a lot of long leggy branches like this that have very little ramification on them. I was pinching all these tips, right? And then whenever I get like a back bud here, I would let it grow and then pinch it again. And repeating that process through half a year, I got this, which is significant, right? And after, I basically unwired the whole tree and rewired it and did a bunch of pruning. And this is that tree basically now. Again, every time I come into the tree, I have to thin it out quite a bit. There's a lot of unusable growth that the tree gives you, right? You get a lot of whorls, you get stuff coming off the bottom, you get stuff coming from all these junctions. So every time you work on this, the tree looks looks a bit sad compared to what, what the tree gave, what the tree gave you after the previous flush. But each time you do this, it's moving forward. So again, if you look at the first styling, that was, wow, last June. That's pretty fast. Wow, it's been a year and a half, and it's come quite a ways. You notice that the apex is criminally underdeveloped right now because I finally cut back the sacrifice branch, and there are like 2 shoots up there. But I have no doubt that now that I've set it up, I've bent it over, and the tree that part of the tree is on top. A whole bunch of buds are going to pop up that will allow me to develop a lot more structure up here for the apex. So that's redwood number 4. Here's another one from the collection that I could not bring. It's a little bit too tall. Again, this is a tree I repotted first. This tree is kind of like it's like a clump style in that it has this big, awesome burl at the bottom and then a whole bunch of trunks coming straight up. So my interpretation of this is kind of more like a clump, like a multi-trunk clump. It's almost like a few trunks growing off, a formation. But I repotted it. I don't have a picture before the repot. I let it blow out, and then I did this for styling. Again, this is how you want your tree to look before you do this kind of styling. Like this is very healthy. I see a lot of people working on trees or pinching them too early and then wanting to style them when they're a little anemic. You want them to be built up in this way such that when you cut them back, they are going to be able to set buds where you cut, right? They're going to have enough energy to do that. So I styled this tree out. This one was a bit challenging actually because I didn't love that I had to use this trunk over here that kind of has this candelabra thing going on. This shape is not very typical in traditional bonsai, but there's not basically this main trunk, it has no foliage on the right side, right? So I needed foliage on this right side to balance out the composition. And the only way to do it was to save this trunk. So I kind of ran with this kind of like reiterative style a little bit, like a bit of a candelabra. And I also had to take 2 really young whips in the back and then just wire them straight up because I had no depth branches otherwise. So those branches were eventually grown out using sacrifice branches. So about half a year later, came in, I pruned again. I left a bunch of sacrifice branches, as you can see here. I had a bit of a 1 year setback because I was renovating my house, so I let it go a little bit. And then when I finally got back into my house, let the tree blow out. There was a pruning I didn't picture here, and then this was the most recent pruning and reset this past year. You can see this in my garden. If any of you come by San Francisco, just let me know. I've since taken off these 2 sacrifice branches, and this tree has moved along quite a bit. So again, 2022, and now, so all those initial pads that I set that were maybe like 2 or 3 green shoots are now kind of starting to take on a bit more structure. It's still fairly young in its development, but you can see how much more meat it's kind of accrued in that time. Also, you also notice how the really thin trunks in the background have kind of, well, it's really hard to see here. They've beefed up quite a bit, and without them, this composition would be quite a bit worse, I think. Okay, that's it. Those are my pictures. Any questions? Anything I can, let's go.
So I'm going first.
Okay. Yes, Ian.
2 questions. Quick one. How many trees do you have in your collection?
About 30 to 40 right now.
Correct answer. The amount of work that you have to do to maintain trees of this quality, that's a hard lesson to learn.
It becomes more and more work, I guess, when they are, they get more refined. That's true.
So redwoods grow on the coast. They're evolved to like take in moisture from the foliage and the clouds, right? You live in San Francisco, so it's a little more humid, but do you actually like water the foliage?
I've read about this. I've heard that adaptation only happens when correct me if I'm wrong, you probably know more about this, but I hear like on really tall trees, you actually see different foliage types on the top part of the tree than the lower part of the tree. Like the leaves on the top of the tree actually have that ability to pull in water kind of feed, pull in water from the fog, whereas the trees, the foliage lower down does not. I don't think we actually get that former kind of foliage in bonsai because our trees are not quite that tall. And what I've heard, I don't know if this is actually true, is that the tree kind of adaptively grows that foliage when it gets tall enough, when it can no longer, I guess, capillary action can no longer pull that water all the way up that length of the tree, right? So just by necessity, it has to feed itself in a different way for up there. So that's part one, but I do actually foliar water on my new theory that foliar watering is probably a good idea in my environment to wash off sea spray. I guess I'm on the coast and I suspect that I have some foliar accumulation of salts that, foliar watering or washing helps. And I do it in the morning typically so that the morning of sunny days, right? So the tree, it can actually dry out before the evening. I don't really want water sitting on my trees overnight to avoid kind of any fungal issues. That's my theory. I don't know if that makes sense, but I know a lot of people have different reasons for foliar watering, and people seem to have good results with foliar watering. So my suspicion is that that's the secret benefit of foliar watering in the Bay Area. Next
I have a question about your tallest tree over here. When we were looking at the slideshow, it looks like you made a decision to put it into that narrow, thin pot really early.
Yes.
Like a lot of times we'll kind of gradually move to a show pot.
Sure.
But I guess you
What?
just had that kind of confidence or your experience, or
Oh, okay.
did
So
you make that decision?
that's a great question. Thanks for asking. For one, for redwoods and other natives that are very strong growers, so especially like redwoods, pygmy cypresses, I find it quite profitable to downsize them to the target show pot immediately to kind of actually constrain their roots and to kind of control their vigor. Just because they're already so vigorous, I mean that's a really small pot. That's probably the minimal size pot you're going to put that tree in, and you can see from the pictures how much growth it's putting on, right? So I find a lot of benefit from constricting the roots on redwoods early on. That's not the case for all trees. Like when I'm developing deciduous trees, I found it better to keep them in a slightly larger pot than the target size pot, just because when they have a bit more roots, they can put on a bit more woody growth that allows me to develop them a bit faster. In terms of the actual risk of the operation of downsizing that tree, that wasn't too hard. Again, whenever I downsize, whenever I do a pot downsizing operation, my goal is maximum survivability and health. And so when I'm doing that downsize, I'm removing soil but not cutting roots, and I'm trying to work that roots into the new container. Subsequent repots, I take it out, I cut off the sides, I cut off the bottom, I remove old soil, and I put it back in. But you typically don't want to do both of those operations at the same time, right? If you're reducing the container size by 50% and you also cut off 50% of the roots, you may be endangering the tree. So I did it that way and I had no problems. So sure you can do it too. Any other questions?